Sometimes the smallest seat at the table is the one that changes the biggest life. No one inside Sterling House expected a little girl to interrupt a meeting worth hundreds of millions of dollars. No one imagined that the quiet waitress eating alone in the corner would become the reason an entire boardroom fell silent. And certainly no one believed that one ordinary father, dressed in faded jeans and worn work boots, had already taught his daughter the lesson that money could never buy. The lunch rush had begun to slow inside the historic restaurant overlooking downtown Chicago. Crystal glasses reflected the afternoon sunlight pouring through floor-to-ceiling windows. Silverware clicked softly against porcelain plates. The scent of fresh bread, roasted herbs, and dark coffee drifted through the air while conversations blended into a warm, comfortable hum. Behind the polished dining room, hidden just beyond the swinging kitchen doors, Claire Bennett finally sat down for the first time that day. Her feet ached after nearly 6 straight hours of serving customers without stopping. She carefully unfolded the simple turkey sandwich she had packed before sunrise, placing it beside a small paper cup of soup that had already gone lukewarm. Around her, every other employee had already finished their breaks. She had become used to eating alone. Across the dining room, Ethan Brooks guided his 8-year-old daughter toward a booth near the window. Their clothes were clean but modest. His plaid work shirt still carried the faint scent of fresh cedar from the remodeling job he had finished that morning, and tiny specks of sawdust clung stubbornly to his sleeves. Lily swung her legs beneath the booth, her curious blue eyes studying every corner of the restaurant, while Ethan smiled gently and opened the menu. Before the waitress arrived, Lily quietly looked around the room the way she always did. It had become a habit ever since Ethan taught her something after her mother's passing. Whenever they entered a restaurant, a church, a park, or even a grocery store, she would search for the person sitting alone. Ethan used to tell her that loneliness rarely made noise. It simply waited for someone kind enough to notice. Lily suddenly spotted Claire through the narrow opening beside the kitchen entrance. The young waitress sat by herself at a tiny metal table, staring at her untouched sandwich with tired eyes. There was no phone in her hands, no conversation, no smile, just silence. Lily gently tugged her father's sleeve. "Daddy," she whispered. Ethan looked up from the menu. "May I go sit with her?" she asked softly. Ethan followed her gaze. He saw the exhausted waitress sitting by herself, and without hesitation, he smiled the same quiet smile his daughter had seen her entire life. "If someone has to eat alone," he said, "they should always get the first invitation." Lily climbed carefully out of the booth, picked up her small cup of applesauce, and walked toward Claire without a trace of fear. At that exact moment, behind the closed glass doors of the private executive dining room, Jonathan Sterling, billionaire founder of Sterling Holdings, stood before 12 senior executives discussing the company's largest acquisition of the year. Charts covered the digital display. Attorneys waited with prepared contracts. Financial advisors watched every word. Then Jonathan's eyes drifted through the glass wall overlooking the restaurant. He saw a little girl quietly pull out the empty chair beside the lonely waitress. He watched her smile. He watched the waitress suddenly cover her mouth as tears filled her eyes. Jonathan froze. The presentation continued for another heartbeat before he slowly raised one hand. "Stop the meeting," he said, his voice calm but unmistakable. Every executive turned toward him in stunned confusion, unaware that the most important decision of the day was no longer waiting inside the boardroom. The room remained perfectly still after Jonathan Sterling lowered his hand. No one questioned him. No one reached for the contracts waiting on the polished walnut table. 12 executives simply watched as the billionaire continued looking through the glass wall, not at the financial projections that had consumed months of preparation, but at a little girl sharing applesauce with a waitress who had been invisible to almost everyone else. Claire blinked repeatedly, trying to hide the tears gathering in her eyes. "You really wanted to sit with me?" she asked quietly. Lily nodded as if the answer were the most obvious thing in the world. "Daddy says everybody deserves company when they eat." Claire looked toward Ethan, who remained seated across the dining room. He simply offered a warm nod, giving his daughter complete trust. There was no pride on his face, no expectation of praise, only quiet certainty that kindness never required permission. Claire smiled for the first time that day. It was small, almost hesitant, but genuine. "Well," she said softly, Thank you for making my lunch a little brighter. Lily carefully peeled the lid from her applesauce and pushed it toward Claire. We can share. Claire laughed gently through damp eyes. I think you should keep your snack. Lily tilted her head. Food tastes better when people share. Those words settled over Claire's heart with surprising weight. They reminded her of a voice she had not heard in years, her own mother saying nearly the same thing before illness slowly took her away. For just a moment, the noisy restaurant disappeared. The worries about overdue rent, long shifts, and lonely evenings faded beneath the simple generosity of a child who expected nothing in return. Ethan watched quietly from his booth, remembering another afternoon many years earlier. His late wife, Emily, had once stopped their family car because she noticed an elderly man eating alone on a park bench. They had shared sandwiches with him without asking his story. On the drive home, she had smiled and told Ethan, Lily may forget expensive toys, but she will never forget how kindness feels. After Emily passed away, Ethan had made himself one promise. He could not give his daughter every comfort. He could not replace the mother they both missed every single day. But he could protect the values that Emily had planted so deeply in their family. So every Saturday, no matter how tight money became, they looked for one small opportunity to brighten someone else's day. Sometimes it meant carrying groceries for an older neighbor. Sometimes it meant leaving flowers at the nursing home. Sometimes it meant paying for a stranger's coffee with the few extra dollars Ethan had earned working overtime. None of those moments ever appeared remarkable. That was exactly the point. Kindness was supposed to feel ordinary. Behind the glass, Jonathan Sterling slowly stepped away from the conference table. His chief financial officer cleared his throat carefully. Sir, the investors from New York are waiting. Jonathan did not answer immediately. Instead, he watched Ethan sitting alone while allowing his daughter to create her own moment of compassion. There was discipline in the father's silence, confidence in his patience, and dignity in the way he never interrupted goodness when it appeared naturally. Jonathan had spent decades studying leadership. He had built companies, negotiated billion-dollar agreements, and interviewed thousands of executives. Yet in all those years, he had rarely witnessed character revealed so effortlessly. Without taking his eyes off the dining room, he spoke quietly enough that everyone leaned forward to hear. Do you know what the rarest quality in business is? Nobody answered. Jonathan finally looked at them. A heart that remains generous after life has given it every reason not to be. The room fell silent once again, but this time the silence carried something different. It carried respect. Jonathan Sterling adjusted the cuff of his navy suit and walked toward the conference room door without another word. The executives exchanged uncertain glances. His legal advisor carefully gathered the untouched contracts while the chief financial officer quietly whispered, Should we postpone? Jonathan stopped with one hand resting on the brass handle. No, he replied calmly. We are simply going to learn something more valuable before we finish today's business. The words lingered behind him as he stepped into the dining room. The polished hardwood floor reflected the afternoon light beneath his shoes. Waiters instinctively straightened their posture as he passed. Guests looked up from their meals, recognizing the familiar face from magazine covers and financial news. Jonathan acknowledged none of them. His attention remained fixed on a small table near the kitchen where a lonely waitress and a cheerful little girl were now laughing together over a cup of applesauce. Claire had not laughed like that in months. It surprised even her. Lily was telling an animated story about accidentally planting watermelon seeds upside down in their tiny backyard, convinced that the watermelons would grow beneath the ground like potatoes. Ethan smiled from across the room, quietly shaking his head as his daughter embellished every detail with enthusiastic hand gestures. Claire listened with genuine amusement, the exhaustion in her eyes slowly giving way to warmth. She almost forgot she was wearing an apron. She almost forgot she still had another shift waiting after lunch. For the first time all week, she simply felt like herself. Jonathan slowed his pace several feet away, choosing not to interrupt immediately. He noticed details that most people would never see. Ethan never once called Lily back to the booth, even though their own meals had already arrived. Trust, Jonathan realized, was visible in the father's patience. Lily never looked around to see whether anyone was watching her good deed. Compassion, he thought, had become natural instead of performative. Claire accepted the child's kindness with gratitude instead of embarrassment. Humility, he quietly observed, still existed in a world that often rewarded pride. A young restaurant manager hurried over, his expression nervous. "Mr. Sterling, would you like us to prepare the private dining suite again?" Jonathan smiled politely, without looking away from the three people before him. "No, thank you." The manager hesitated. "Would you prefer another table?" Jonathan gently shook his head. "The best seat in this building appears to be right there." The manager followed his gaze and looked thoroughly confused. Ethan finally noticed the distinguished gentleman approaching. He recognized Jonathan Sterling immediately, but remained seated. Fame had never impressed him very much. To Ethan, every person deserved the same respect regardless of their title or their bank account. As Jonathan reached the table, Lily looked up. First, she offered him the same bright smile she would have given any stranger. "Hello," she said cheerfully. "Hi there," Jonathan replied with unexpected softness. "May I ask you something?" Lily nodded. "Why did you decide to sit with Miss Claire today?" She answered without needing even a second to think. "Because she looked lonely." Jonathan smiled faintly. "And how could you tell?" Lily shrugged. Her smile stopped when nobody was looking. Claire lowered her eyes, suddenly overwhelmed. Ethan inhaled quietly, recognizing the remarkable truth hidden inside his daughter's simple observation. Jonathan remained silent for several long moments. The sounds of clinking glasses, quiet conversations, and distant kitchen activity seemed to fade into the background. He had spent years evaluating balance sheets, reading market trends, and measuring performance through numbers. Yet one little girl had just demonstrated an emotional intelligence that no business school could teach. Looking toward Ethan, Jonathan spoke with sincere respect. "Sir, your daughter notices what most adults spend their entire lives overlooking." Ethan smiled modestly. "Children usually do. We simply forget how to pay attention as we grow older." Jonathan nodded slowly, feeling those words settle somewhere much deeper than he expected. At that moment, he realized the meeting he had interrupted was no longer the most important conversation waiting to happen that afternoon. Jonathan pulled out an empty chair instead of remaining standing above them. It was a small gesture, almost invisible to everyone else, yet it changed the atmosphere completely. He was no longer the billionaire addressing strangers. He was simply another person asking permission to join a table where kindness had already reserved every seat. "May I sit here for a few minutes?" he asked. Claire looked startled. Ethan nodded politely. Lily answered first. "Of course. There is always room for one more." Jonathan smiled as he lowered himself into the chair. Around them, conversations gradually faded. A few diners recognized him and quietly reached for their phones, but one glance from the restaurant manager politely discouraged. "Any photographs?" Whatever was happening at that little table felt too personal to interrupt. Jonathan folded his hands together and looked toward Claire. "How long have you worked here?" "Almost 7 years," she replied. "I started as a hostess while I was finishing community college. Then life changed, and I stayed." There was no bitterness in her voice, only acceptance. Ethan noticed the careful way she chose her words, as though she had learned long ago that some stories did not need to be explained to earn sympathy. Jonathan nodded thoughtfully. 7 years is a long time to serve other people. Claire gave a quiet smile. "Someone has to make sure everyone feels welcome." Lily tilted her head. "Who makes you feel welcome?" Claire blinked. The innocent question caught her completely off guard. She looked down at her folded napkin before answering with an honest little laugh. "I guess I never really thought about that." Lily reached across the table and gently touched Claire's hand with her tiny fingers. "Maybe you should." Ethan watched his daughter with quiet admiration. She never tried to solve people's problems. She simply noticed them, and sometimes that was enough. Jonathan leaned back slightly, listening more than speaking. He had attended thousands of meetings throughout his career, each one filled with polished presentations and carefully chosen words. Yet this simple conversation carried more truth than many boardrooms ever had. The restaurant lights reflected softly against the windows as clouds drifted across the Chicago skyline outside. Somewhere behind the kitchen doors, a timer chimed. Fresh bread emerged from the ovens, filling the air with the comforting aroma of butter and rosemary. Life continued around them, but at that table time seemed to move differently. Jonathan finally looked toward Ethan. "Your daughter has remarkable instincts." Ethan smiled. "She had an extraordinary mother." He paused briefly before continuing. "After my wife passed away, I worried every day that Lily would remember the sadness more than the love. So instead of talking about grief, we practiced kindness. It became our way of keeping Emily close. Claire's eyes softened. She must have been a wonderful woman. Ethan looked toward the window, where sunlight rested gently across the glass. She believed every lonely person is carrying a story that deserves gentleness before questions. For several seconds no one spoke. Even Jonathan found himself reflecting on those words. They sounded simple, but they carried the weight of experience rather than philosophy. Lily suddenly looked at Claire again. Is today a hard day? Claire hesitated. She had not intended to tell anyone. Yet something about the honesty surrounding the table made pretending feel unnecessary. She slowly nodded. Today would have been my mother's birthday. Lily squeezed her hand just a little tighter. Then I am really glad you were not eating by yourself. Claire closed her eyes for a brief moment as another tear escaped despite her best effort to hide it. Jonathan quietly reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, not to offer money or a business card, but to remove a neatly folded handkerchief. He placed it gently beside Claire without saying a single word. She looked at him with surprised gratitude. In that quiet exchange, Jonathan understood something he had not fully realized until now. Real dignity was never displayed through wealth. It revealed itself through people who chose compassion first, even when nobody expected them to. Jonathan remained seated for another quiet moment, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table as though he were protecting the fragile peace that had settled there. Then his phone vibrated once inside his jacket. He glanced at the screen before placing it face down without answering. The message simply read, "Board members are waiting." For the first time in years, the meeting could wait. The people before him could not. Claire carefully folded the handkerchief after drying her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Jonathan smiled gently. "Keep it. I have learned that some things become more valuable after they have served their purpose." Ethan appreciated the remark. It sounded less like something a billionaire would say, and more like something his own father might have believed years ago. Lily looked curiously between the adults before taking another bite of her sandwich. "Daddy says people are more important than schedules." Jonathan chuckled quietly. "Your father is wiser than many chief executives I know." Ethan laughed softly. He would disagree with that. Would he? Jonathan asked. "Maybe," Ethan replied. He always believed wisdom looks ordinary when the right person is carrying it. Those words settled into Jonathan's thoughts. He had spent decades rewarding efficiency, strategy, and ambition. Yet sitting at this modest table, he began wondering how many truly remarkable people had quietly passed through his companies without ever being noticed because they did not promote themselves. Across the dining room, several executives stood behind the glass wall, watching with growing curiosity. One younger vice president leaned toward another and whispered, "I have never seen him postpone a negotiation for anything." The older executive answered just as quietly, "Neither have I. Whatever he sees over there must matter more than numbers." Meanwhile, Claire glanced toward the dining room clock mounted above the service station. Her break had nearly ended. The familiar weight of responsibility returned to her shoulders. She stood slowly, smoothing the front of her apron. "I should get back to work." Jonathan looked up. "May I ask you one more question?" She nodded. "Why do you always smile at your customers?" Claire seemed surprised by the question. She thought for a moment before answering. "Because most people carry burdens that nobody else can see. I never know which smile might be the first kind thing they receive all day." Jonathan lowered his eyes. Her answer stirred a memory that had remained untouched for nearly a decade. A hospital hallway. White walls. Long nights filled with uncertainty. A young nurse sitting beside a frightened little girl, reading stories until she finally fell asleep. He could not remember the nurse's face anymore. He only remembered her kindness. The feeling disappeared as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind nothing but a quiet sense of familiarity that he could not yet explain. Lily slid carefully off her chair and hugged Claire around the waist without warning. "Happy birthday to your mommy," she said softly. "I hope she knows somebody shared lunch with you today." Claire wrapped her arms around the little girl, holding her gently as tears filled her eyes once again. "Thank you, sweetheart." Ethan stood and gathered their trays. He never interrupted the embrace. Some moments deserved silence more than conversation. Jonathan rose as well. Looking at Ethan, he extended his hand. Ethan accepted it with a firm but humble handshake. Neither man tried to impress the other. They simply acknowledged the quiet respect that had grown between them. Jonathan spoke carefully. "I hope this is not the last time our paths cross." Ethan smiled. "Life has a funny way of bringing good people together when they least expect it." Jonathan nodded, feeling those words settle deep inside him. As Claire turned toward the kitchen doors, a small silver locket slipped from beneath the collar of her uniform. It swung gently for only a second before she tucked it back beneath the fabric. Jonathan caught the briefest glimpse of an engraved blue forget-me-not flower on its surface. His heartbeat slowed. Something about that tiny locket reached into a place in his memory that had been silent for years. He could not explain why, but for the first time since entering the restaurant, he was no longer certain that this meeting had been interrupted by chance. Claire disappeared through the swinging kitchen doors, but Jonathan remained where he stood, his attention lingering on the place where the silver locket had rested only moments before. The tiny blue forget-me-not engraved on its surface refused to leave his thoughts. It was not merely familiar. It belonged to a memory he had spent years trying to preserve without ever fully understanding why it still mattered so much. Ethan placed their empty trays onto the return cart and helped Lily slip into her light blue sweater. "Ready to head home, kiddo?" he asked gently. Lily nodded, but before they could leave, Jonathan stepped closer once again. "Would you allow me to buy the two of you dessert before you go?" Ethan smiled appreciatively, but shook his head. "That is kind of you, but we have homemade peach pie waiting at home. Lily has been reminding me about it since breakfast." Lily grinned proudly. "I helped bake it." Jonathan laughed softly. "Then I certainly cannot compete with that." The simplicity of the exchange warmed him in a way he had not expected. Here was a father who never measured generosity by money. He measured it by promises kept. As Ethan reached for his jacket, Jonathan spoke again. "May I ask what you do for a living?" "Residential carpenter," Ethan answered. "Mostly home renovations and custom cabinetry. Nothing glamorous, but it pays the bills." "And you enjoy it?" Jonathan asked. Ethan looked down at his calloused hands before smiling. "Wood has a funny way of teaching patience. If you rush it, you ruin it. People are not very different." Jonathan quietly absorbed the answer. Every sentence Ethan spoke seemed shaped by experience rather than ambition. It reminded him of conversations he used to have with his own grandfather before success had filled his calendar and emptied his afternoons. Across the restaurant, Claire returned carrying a fresh pot of coffee for another table. She moved gracefully from guest to guest, remembering names, refilling glasses before anyone asked, thanking every customer with genuine appreciation. She never noticed Jonathan watching from a distance. She certainly never noticed that his expression had become increasingly thoughtful with every passing minute. A young busboy approached Claire carrying a stack of heavy dinner plates that threatened to slide from his arms. Before he could say anything, Claire set down her own tray and quietly took half the plates from him. "I have got these," she said with an encouraging smile. "Thank you," the young man replied, clearly relieved. "You always seem to know when someone needs help." Claire laughed gently. "That is because someone once noticed me when I needed it." She continued walking before he could ask what she meant. Jonathan heard every word. Something stirred once more inside his memory. "Someone once noticed me." The sentence echoed against another voice from years ago, but the connection remained frustratingly out of reach. His assistant finally approached from the conference room, carrying a leather portfolio. "Mr. Sterling," she said quietly, "the board is asking whether they should reschedule the afternoon agenda." Jonathan accepted the portfolio without opening it. Instead, he asked an unexpected question. "How long has this restaurant employed Claire Bennett?" His assistant blinked. "I'm not sure, sir. Please find out." "Of course." She paused before adding, "Is there a business concern?" Jonathan looked toward Claire as she laughed with an elderly couple celebrating what appeared to be an anniversary. "No," he answered softly. "There is a human one." Ethan took Lily's hand as they prepared to leave. Before stepping outside, Lily turned and waved enthusiastically toward Claire. Claire waved back with the brightest smile Ethan had seen on her face all afternoon. Jonathan watched the exchange with quiet admiration. The little girl had arrived carrying nothing more valuable than kindness. Yet somehow she was leaving behind something that could not be purchased, negotiated, or inherited. As the restaurant door closed behind Ethan and Lily, a gentle breeze drifted through the entrance, rustling the pages of a framed newspaper displayed near the host's stand. Jonathan's eyes fell upon the faded headline by pure chance. It featured a photograph from nearly 10 years earlier of the children's wing at St. Catherine Medical Center after a major renovation funded anonymously by his family. His gaze shifted slowly from the picture to Claire, and then back again. His heartbeat quickened. The young volunteer standing beside his frightened daughter in that old photograph wore a silver locket with a single blue forget-me-not flower. Jonathan slowly lifted the framed newspaper from the display near the host's stand, holding it carefully, as though it were far more valuable than the expensive artwork hanging throughout the restaurant. Time had faded the ink, but not the memory it carried. There she was. A young volunteer with kind eyes sat beside a frightened little girl in a hospital bed, reading from a children's storybook while wearing the same silver locket with the blue forget-me-not flower. Jonathan's breathing became almost imperceptibly slower. He remembered that week more clearly than he had allowed himself to in years. His daughter, Amelia, had been only 9 years old, recovering after emergency surgery. Every specialist had monitored her physical healing, yet one quiet volunteer had somehow cared for her heart. She had appeared every afternoon after classes, reading stories, folding paper birds, drawing little stars on napkins, and reminding a frightened child that tomorrow always deserved another chance. Jonathan had searched for that volunteer after Amelia returned home, hoping to thank her properly, but hospital privacy policies revealed nothing. All he had ever known was that her first name was Claire. The photograph trembled ever so slightly in his hands. His assistant returned carrying a tablet. "Sir, I found the employment records you requested. Claire Bennett has worked here for 6 years and 10 months. Jonathan looked up immediately. Before that, she scrolled through the information. She volunteered at St. Catherine Medical Center while attending community college. Pediatric support program. Jonathan closed his eyes for one brief moment. The missing pieces quietly settled into place. It had been her all along. Not a coincidence. Not a resemblance. The lonely waitress serving coffee only a few yards away was the young woman who had given his daughter hope during the hardest season of their family's life. Across the dining room, Claire refilled another coffee cup for an elderly gentleman. She laughed warmly when his wife teased him about secretly ordering a second slice of apple pie. She thanked them for visiting, wiped the table after they left, and carried the dishes back toward the kitchen without the slightest awareness that someone nearby had just uncovered a chapter of her own past. Jonathan watched her with quiet admiration. She had not changed. 10 years had passed. Circumstances had become more difficult, yet her kindness remained exactly the same. She still noticed tired people. She still carried burdens without complaint. She still gave pieces of herself away one conversation at a time. His assistant lowered her voice. "Would you like me to arrange a private meeting with Miss Bennett?" Jonathan slowly shook his head. "No." She looked surprised. "Sir, if gratitude has waited 10 years, it can wait until she finishes serving her guests." The assistant smiled softly. That answer sounded very different from the businessman she had worked beside for nearly 15 years. Meanwhile, Ethan and Lily had reached the sidewalk outside the restaurant. Lily skipped happily beside her father, still talking about Claire. "Do you think she smiled more because we sat with her?" Ethan squeezed her little hand. "I think people remember how they are treated long after they forget what they were given." Lily looked up thoughtfully. "Mom used to say something like that." Ethan smiled toward the afternoon sky. "She did." They continued walking toward the small pickup truck parked across the street, never realizing that the simple lunch they had shared had quietly reopened a story that began long before they entered the restaurant. Back inside, Jonathan carefully returned the framed newspaper to its place and looked once more toward Claire. She was helping a young family settle into a booth, kneeling briefly so she could speak to their little boy at eye level before handing him a coloring page and a box of crayons. The child smiled instantly. Jonathan felt his throat tighten with emotion. There was no performance in her kindness. There never had been. She loved people the same way the sun warmed a room, without asking who deserved the light. In that quiet realization, Jonathan finally understood why Lily had walked straight toward Claire without hesitation. Children often recognized goodness long before adults learned how to see it. The afternoon sunlight slowly softened across the restaurant windows as the lunch crowd gave way to a quieter rhythm. Coffee cups became fewer. Conversations grew gentler. Claire continued moving from table to table with the same steady grace that had first caught Lily's attention. She thanked every guest sincerely, remembered each regular customer's favorite dessert, and paused long enough to ask an elderly woman whether her husband was recovering well after surgery. The woman smiled with grateful surprise. "He is finally walking again," she said. Claire clasped her hands together. "That is wonderful news." She celebrated the answer as though it belonged to her own family. Jonathan watched from a distance, saying nothing. The more he observed, the more certain he became that gratitude could not remain hidden another day. He quietly approached the restaurant manager. "When Miss Bennett finishes her shift, please let her know I would appreciate 5 minutes of her time. Only if she is comfortable." The manager nodded respectfully. "Of course, Mr. Sterling." Nearly an hour later, Claire untied her apron and folded it carefully inside her locker. She checked her reflection only long enough to smooth a loose strand of hair behind her ear before stepping into the empty private dining room. Jonathan was already waiting beside the window, but instead of standing at the head of the long conference table, he had chosen one of the ordinary chairs facing the skyline. There were no attorneys, no executives, and no assistants. Only 2 cups of freshly brewed coffee rested quietly between them. "Thank you for meeting with me," Jonathan said warmly. Claire smiled politely. "Your manager said you wanted to speak with me." Jonathan nodded. "First, I want to ask you something." She waited patiently. "About 10 years ago, did you volunteer at St. Catherine Medical Center?" Claire blinked in surprise. Her eyes searched his face for several long seconds before recognition slowly appeared. "Your daughter," she whispered. Jonathan smiled gently. "Amelia." Claire's expression softened immediately. She loved astronomy books. She always asked whether the stars looked different from hospital windows. Jonathan laughed quietly through gathering emotion. "She still does." Claire smiled. "How is she?" "She is healthy. She graduated from college last spring." Claire placed one hand over her heart. "That is wonderful." Jonathan looked at her with quiet amazement. She had not asked about his companies, his success, or why he had searched for her. She had only asked about Amelia. Just as she had 10 years earlier, the child still mattered more than anything else. Jonathan reached into his briefcase and carefully removed the faded newspaper clipping. He laid it gently on the table between them. Claire looked down and smiled with quiet nostalgia. "I forgot someone took that photograph." Jonathan shook his head. "I never forgot." He paused before continuing. "My daughter told me that every afternoon you would read stories until she stopped being afraid. You folded paper birds because she believed they could carry prayers through hospital windows. You stayed after your volunteer hours ended because you noticed she became anxious when the evenings grew quiet. You never accepted a single dollar." Claire lowered her eyes modestly. She was a brave little girl. "I only kept her company." Jonathan leaned forward slightly. "You gave hope to my family when money could not solve our greatest fear." Silence filled the room with gentle dignity. Finally, Jonathan placed a neatly prepared folder on the table. Inside is an offer. A scholarship foundation in your mother's name, full financial support if you wish to complete your education, and a leadership position within our family's charitable organization whenever you feel ready. Claire looked at the folder but made no move to open it. Instead, she smiled kindly and said the words Jonathan never expected to hear. "That is incredibly generous, but before I answer, may I ask one favor?" Jonathan nodded. "Please tell Amelia that seeing her healthy is already the greatest thank you I could ever receive." Jonathan felt his eyes grow warm. In that quiet moment, he understood that genuine kindness never kept a record of what it had given, and perhaps that was exactly why it possessed the extraordinary power to change lives long after everyone else believed the story had ended. 1 year later, the first Saturday of autumn arrived with crisp air, golden leaves, and the comforting scent of cinnamon drifting through downtown Chicago. The small community center on Maple Street buzzed with quiet excitement as families gathered around long wooden tables decorated with handmade paper stars created by local children. Above the entrance, a simple sign read, "The Emily Brooks Family Table." There were no exclusive invitations, no reserved seats, and no dress code. Anyone who felt alone was welcome. The idea had started with one little girl who believed nobody should eat by themselves. Ethan adjusted a vase of fresh sunflowers while Lily carefully arranged homemade cookies beside baskets of warm bread. She was 9 now, just a little taller, but her bright smile remained exactly the same. Every time someone walked through the doors looking uncertain, she greeted them as though they had been expected all along. Across the room, Claire laughed as she helped a group of volunteers prepare soup and sandwiches. A few months after that unforgettable afternoon, she had accepted Jonathan Sterling's offer in a way that surprised everyone. She agreed to help lead the charitable foundation, but only on one condition. She wanted to continue serving meals directly to people every weekend because, as she quietly explained, compassion should never become something managed only from an office. Jonathan accepted without hesitation. In fact, he admired her even more for asking. The scholarship foundation established in her mother's honor had already helped dozens of students pursuing nursing, education, and community service. Yet Claire still wore the same silver locket every day, still remembered regular customers by name, and still believed the greatest gift anyone could receive was being noticed. Jonathan entered the community center carrying 2 fresh apple pies baked by Amelia, who now volunteered beside him whenever her schedule allowed. The frightened little girl who once watched paper birds drift across a hospital room had grown into a confident young woman studying pediatric medicine. She walked straight toward Claire and embraced her warmly. "You were right," Amelia said softly. "Tomorrow always deserved another chance." Claire smiled with grateful eyes. "And you proved it." Jonathan looked around the crowded room before finding Ethan near the coffee station. The 2 men shook hands the same way they had the first day they met, with quiet respect rather than ceremony. "I have attended hundreds of ribbon cuttings," Jonathan admitted. "None of them have ever felt as meaningful as this room." Ethan looked around at the families sharing meals, neighbors introducing themselves, children laughing together, and volunteers carrying extra chairs so no one would sit alone. "Kindness grows best when everyone brings a chair instead of building another wall," he replied. Jonathan nodded slowly, recognizing once again the wisdom hidden inside ordinary words. As lunch began, every seat around every table slowly filled. Elderly widowers shared stories with college students. Military veterans laughed beside young parents. Strangers arrived carrying invisible burdens and left carrying conversations instead. Lily walked carefully through the room until she noticed one final empty chair resting quietly against the far wall. She picked it up without saying a word and carried it beside an older woman who had been eating alone. The woman looked surprised. Lily smiled the same gentle smile that had changed so many lives before. "There," she said. "Now nobody has to eat alone." Ethan watched his daughter from across the room, his heart filled with peaceful gratitude. Claire noticed him watching and smiled back. Jonathan lowered his eyes for a quiet moment, understanding at last that the greatest legacy any person could leave behind was never measured by buildings, businesses, or fortunes. It was measured by the number of lonely hearts that discovered hope because one ordinary act of kindness inspired another. And somewhere beyond the conversations, beyond the laughter, beyond the warm afternoon light shining through the windows, it felt as though Emily's lesson still lived on, not only inside one little girl, but inside every person who chose to notice the empty chair before taking their own seat.